Thank you so much for joining us today, JP. So let's start off with your views on the need and urgency to address the infrastructure gap right now, because you wrote an opinion piece talking about the window of opportunity will not be open forever. Basically, explain your views right now.
I think one of the problems with Africa is that it's a 12-1-2 number. It's 12% of the world's population, 1% of the world's GDP, and 2% of the world's trade. And I think the 1 and the 2 is the part of the problem. There's so much potential, but it's just not developing. Physical infrastructure is about people, goods and ideas moving from one place to another. And I think the barriers that underdeveloped or underdeveloped infrastructure are just crippling Africa's growth.
Well, I mean, this is not a new issue right now, and of course you're involved in many projects that are addressing this. Just talk to us about the role of the private sector as you see it in addressing this infrastructure gap.
When one looks at the infrastructure gap, you can look at one of two points. It's either from a funding point of view or a construction point of view. From a construction point of view, the private sector has always been involved in infrastructure, whether it's South, Southern or Africa as a whole. All of the construction projects, whether they're government enabled, have been done or developed by the private sector. But I think that's been a very limited scope for private sector involvement. I think the opportunity for private sector involvement starts even earlier, is looking at the development of projects, looking at the funding of projects, and then the delivery.
So almost at the pre-feasibility study, addressing where infrastructure is needed, and someone needs to initiate that. Is that an issue right now? Is it government's role to initiate that? Is that advisors' role, like yourself, consultants? I mean, is that a question mark that needs to be addressed?
I think it's a dual role. I think various governments do have long-term growth strategies, whether it's the South African government's plan or the Kenyan government's plan, and they have identified their priorities. The question is taking those priorities and actually turning them into a viable project. I think that's where the private sector can help, in taking an identified project and packaging it sufficiently to take to market, either as some form of public-private partnership or even traditional government procurement, where they're going to ask the private sector to ultimately build it.
And in terms of tendering, what are the themes you're seeing right now when it comes to financing of these infrastructure projects? And what are your thoughts in terms of the evolution of PPPs in the infrastructure space?
Traditionally, government projects have been funded on budget. And I think the budget constraints facing countries worldwide has reduced the opportunity for developing projects. So involving the private sector in funding and through a public-private partnership process, I think, is going to be an increasing way for governments to deliver on their mandate. I
mean, just in terms of, returns, because that's, of course, private sector financiers would be looking for. Is this a space that, private institutions, financial institutions want to put their money into it in order to get attractive returns further down the line?
I think there are attractive returns. The private sector's trying to manage their returns, and they've got an investment choice to choose from. But essentially, a lot of public-private partnerships, you have the government as an end user. So you do have a stability on your return. And I think if you've modeled it properly and controlled your prices, it is still a very attractive project option.
And there's money. I mean, you seeing from your side, is this a priority area?
Yes, I think there is a lot of money available. You have a lot of the development finance institutions, which I think are looking for good projects. And if you're using a development finance institution, I think that also can provide a lot of comfort and security to commercial lenders as well.
So right now for you, I mean, this is a very broad statement, but what would you say is the biggest hurdle to development of infrastructure, much needed infrastructure, and infrastructure that has been identified?
I think it's our view that there's an inconsistency in government policy. I think a need has been expressed for development of infrastructure, but sometimes government policy actions and statements undermine that consistency of flow of project deals to the market.